In this video, I explain the building blocks of carbon accounting and map out the connections between them. Now, there are many people who are trying to get Salesforce Net Zero Cloud certified, and when they are preparing for their certification, when they are studying for their exam, they come across Salesforce Net Zero Cloud data model. Many of them, when they see this big PDF open in front of them, they feel quite overwhelmed. Now, I've gone through the same situation and I followed a different approach while preparing for the certification. So instead of focusing on the entire model, what my approach was to pick up one object, say stationary asset environmental source, and see what goes in and out of it from the basic building blocks. So in this video, I will try to break down this data model into smaller manageable components. And as we progress by understanding the key building blocks of carbon accounting, we will together try and build the data model with limited components. I repeat once more that this is the approach I followed while preparing for the certification, and this is not the only way to tackle it. Without any further delay, let's begin. For carbon accounting process, there are four key building blocks: emission sources, energy use records, emission factors, and carbon footprint. We will cover these briefly. Link to the Salesforce documentation is provided in the description box below. Please check it out for detailed explanation. Until now, in our video series, we have seen how the admin can set up and configure the Net Zero Cloud. Before proceeding further with the carbon accounting, it is important to know about the key fundamental objects of carbon accounting. The first one is the emission sources. These are the assets of the organizations which produce or which generate the carbon emissions. Buildings, vehicles, and scope 3 activities like business travel and procurement fall under the emission sources. Emission sources are further divided into three, as you can see here. The stationary asset environmental sources, as the name suggests, are the assets that are stationary in nature. The office buildings, warehouses, the data centers, etc. fall under this category. The vehicle asset emission sources are the assets which are mobile in nature. For example, the vehicles, private jets, etc. The scope 3 emission sources like transportation or the hotel stay, air travel, purchase and selling of goods, and so on. Check out the link in the description to learn more about how emissions are classified as scope 1, 2, and 3. We will now start mapping the relationship between the objects. Now I'm going to focus only on the stationary asset. So this is our object, stationary asset environmental source. I'm not going to cover the vehicle assets and the scope 3 asset sources here for the mapping purposes. The next building block is the energy use records. Now, energy use records, they are created for a specific date range or date and associated with the source. For instance, we have monthly electricity bill for an office, say 1000 kilowatt hours, and we want to use this energy use data and convert it into the carbon emissions. So when you create a new stationary asset energy use record, you fill in the name, the source, the date range, and the consumption details like fuel consumption, it is 1000 kilowatt hours, unit is kilowatt hours, fuel type is electricity, and so on. The Net Zero Cloud, it does this calculation for you. It uses the emissions factors assigned to the source. Now, of course, these emissions factors can be overridden at energy use record level, and more about it later in another video. Obviously, the next object or the next key component is the emissions factors. Prior to having a look at it, let us build upon our model. So what we have here is stationary asset energy use records. And we also have electricity emissions factor set and other emissions factor set. Let us see how these are connected to each other, how they are related. Now, one stationary asset, that is a one commercial building or one office, we can say, it is going to have multiple stationary asset energy use records. For instance, electricity bills for all the 12 months. So what here we do is, let us try to establish that relation, something like this. One asset, multiple energy use record. We will come to the emissions factors in a moment, but when you create a stationary asset environmental source, the required fields are electricity emissions factor set and the other emissions. So one factor can be applied to multiple sources. Two different offices can have the same emissions factors. So here it is like this. Single emissions factors can be applied to multiple sources. Single source can have multiple energy use records. Now let us these emissions. Emissions factors are used to convert the energy consumption into carbon emissions. Several emissions factors in the form of reference data are pre-configured in Net Zero Cloud. It includes electricity emissions factors, other emissions factors, and so on. I have a separate video dedicated on how to load reference data in netzerocloud.org. Link is in the description box below. Now, carbon dioxide emissions, they are based on the energy consumption. For scope 3, this factor is based on the monetary value spent. For instance, carbon dioxide equivalent in metric tons per million US dollars spent or per million Norwegian kroner spent. Let us go ahead and update our diagram. We have seen how the source is related to the emissions factor set. Now, the energy use records also have the field of these emissions factors. This is where the emissions factors can be overwritten. Otherwise, it is going to take the factors that are allocated to the source. Just as the source, a single emission factor set can be applied to multiple energy use records. So the relation is this. Now comes the last building block, which is the carbon footprints. Carbon footprints, they estimate the amount of carbon dioxide which is released in the atmosphere. They summarize the values from multiple energy use records. We have three emission sources and corresponding three carbon footprints related to them. The stationary asset carbon footprint is summarized from the energy use records for the stationary asset. Similarly, for vehicle asset carbon footprint, the records are summarized from energy use records for vehicle asset emission source. Now, scope 3 carbon footprint, it gives the overall emissions from the energy uses for scope 3 activity. On the scope 3 carbon footprint, you associate the emission source and you can also associate it the stationary asset source which is related to this carbon footprint. We will see that when we actually create some records in the org. Let us update the diagram. Stationary asset carbon footprint. As I mentioned, it summarizes the records from energy use. Multiple energy use records, they roll up to stationary asset carbon footprint. Now, stationary asset carbon footprint, again, it is also related to the source. One source can have multiple carbon footprints. So let us quickly summarize the four objects we have seen until now. Stationary asset environmental source. It should have the electricity and emissions factor set. So one factor can be applied to several sources. The asset, the source, will have multiple energy use records. These energy use records also have the emissions factors added to them. Now, if it is to be overridden, then it is at the energy use record level. Otherwise, it is going to take the emissions factors that are allocated at the source level. Next comes the stationary asset carbon footprint. It summarizes the energy use records. So one footprint will have multiple energy use records. Similarly, your source is also going to have multiple carbon footprint record. This carbon footprint will have carbon footprint items. For example, the stationary asset carbon footprint, it can have electricity, heat, etc. as items. So it is composed of several different items. One footprint, several items. Source is Trailhead. Here they have shown all the key components which have been discussed and how they are connected to each other. And what we did is try to create a data model with limited components. You can follow the similar approach and do it for vehicle asset, for scope 3 assets, and build upon this model, right? So in this video, we have learned about the building blocks of carbon accounting and how they are related to each other. So this is the approach I followed while I was preparing for my certification. I repeat, this is not the only approach. I hope you found this video quite insightful and it forms the base to your carbon accounting journey. Please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting content. Thank you for watching.